afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're in. I know that this is a national audience, and so I never really know where everybody is. But I've been tasked today with talking about how bad things are. We all heard Ryan talk about the stock market being about as bad as we've ever seen it. We just don't know whether the wheels are all going to come off. I want to go beyond the stock market. We've all had friends or know people that complain about how bad things are these days, or how afraid they are about what the kids growing up today are going to have to deal with, or that the future looks bleaker and bleaker each year. Steven Pinker, in his book, Enlightenment Now, shows us this mindset is not just wrong, but it's flat earth wrong. There's just times in the book that Pinker starts blaming people or institutions that he feels have held the world back. And in my opinion, this distracts from the overall work and has probably stopped it from being much more broadly known. But his scholarly documentation of the progress that mankind has made over the past few hundred years is really hard to argue with. As humans, we have trouble seeing the forest through the trees because we are so close to these positive current events that it's just hard to really tell what's going on. Let's consider some of the many ways that we are a lot better off than we were. Healthcare is one way. Life expectancies that were stuck at around 29 years of life expectancy throughout most of world history, all of a sudden have jumped up and was 71 years in 2015 when Pinker wrote his book. Child mortality was in the 30% range just 200 years ago. Child mortality is now only about 1%. Even in sub-Saharan Africa, child mortality has dropped from about 1 in 4 in the 1960s to about 1 in 10 now. So we've made tremendous progress just in the last 50 to 60 years. Since the late 18th century, in Europe, the rate at which women died in childbirth has dropped 300-fold. They dropped from 1.2% of births to 0.004%. That is clearly good news for everyone that mothers are coming out of childbirth intact. Healthcare advances such as eradication of polio and smallpox, the use of penicillin and chlorinated water, things like immunology and imaging technologies have saved an estimated 5 billion lives. I'll tell you, there are a lot of people out there that would be dead if they lived in another era. Let's talk about hunger. Calorie intake worldwide has risen 30% just since World War II, meaning there's a lot less starvation. 35% of their citizens suffering from undernourishment as recently as 1970. Today, that figure is around 12%. That's only 1/3 of what it was just 50 years ago. So hunger is being reduced almost everywhere. In 1820, 90% of the world population lived in extreme poverty. Today, that number is in single digits. Places that were miserably poor, like South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, are now comfortably rich. The world has become a wealthy place. Now, the common myth is that most of the new wealth is just going to rich folks these days. But you have to remember that a rising tide lifts all boats. If 1 million poor people double their income and are lifted out of poverty, they couldn't care less if one billionaire doubles his wealth. There's going to be 1 million families that have less hunger, more education, more creature comforts, and that makes for a lot of happy families. This is a good thing. Our changing climate is sort of a hot topic, if you'll excuse the pun. And there's many factors to consider, but some of the things that people focus on are things like CO2. In both the US and Europe, CO2 emissions have declined since 1980. The number of oil spills have declined from over 100 per year in the 1970s to an average of less than 10 per year now. Population growth rates have declined from over 2% per year to less than 1.2% per year and are expected to decline to 0.2% per year during the century, as reductions in poverty and child mortality reduce the need for large families. Populations, what this means is populations are soon going to be shrinking. And the problems due to overpopulation that everybody's worried about are going to fade into the dustbin of history. The war is a constant worry for many. And despite the headlines from Ukraine, wars are much less frequent now than they were before. In the 1700s, it was common for the majority of great powers to be at war in any one year. Today, the frequency is close to zero. Genocide, common in the past, is rare these days. And on a personal level, we're much safer these days too. Homicides have declined in the US by half since the 1980s. Motor vehicle deaths per million miles driven are 1/10, and pedestrian deaths are 1/6 what they were 100 years ago. Accident deaths, deaths from falls, fire, drowning, things like that, are down 80% in the last 100 years. And workplace deaths are 5% of what they were a century ago. Even deaths from natural disasters are only 1/10 of what they were back 100 years ago. Clearly, we're all a lot safer than we used to be. All of this means that almost everyone has a greater ability to enjoy life than they did 50 or 100 years ago. Democracy is making a slow march throughout the world, and with democracy comes a rule of law that gives us greater equality, less homophobia, less social problems in general than totalitarian governments. So the next time that you have a naysayer friend commenting on how bad things are, you can just say you respectfully disagree because you've seen the data that proves just the opposite. We're doing great and we're getting better all the time. Now, one exception to this getting better all the time theme of mine might be the financial markets. As Ryan mentioned, both stocks and bonds are off significantly this year. At Shadow Ridge, we don't just idly sit by and let losses pile up. We take action. Lately, we've moved the majority of our assets out of the market into cash and money market funds. One of our more aggressive portfolios is actually short the market, meaning we can make profits when an index posts losses. Making these moves for our clients is what we call proactive management. Unlike ordinary advisors who tell clients to be patient while losses pile up, at Shadow Ridge, we adapt to changing markets. If you're already a client, stop worrying. We've got you covered, and we're protecting your account values.